Hello, everyone. This is Laura Dyer with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We had an incredible amount of interest in this webinar. So while folks are getting connected and logging in, I'm just going to start by going over some of our technical details for the webinar so that we can hopefully have a smooth experience for everyone who's logged in. And just let you know a little bit about how you can participate and mute your lines and unmute. So if you are connected to the webinar and are dialed in listening to the meeting audio using your telephone, you'll likely want to mute your computer speakers to avoid any feedback and echo. We're going to be showing some slides and using a polling feature of the webinar. So if you're listening in on your telephone and haven't yet joined the webinar room online, doing so will just let you fully participate and follow along. The webinar technology that we're using today here is Adobe Connect Pro. So what you'll see on the left-hand side above the chat, that's where the presentation slides will be displayed. So right now you should be seeing a welcome slide. To the right of that welcome slide, you should see a picture and details for Jerry Weisner, who will be talking with all of you throughout today's webinar. So we're so happy to have her here with us. Below Jerry is our attendee list, and this is a list of all who are signed on right now. You can send private chat messages to me with technical questions or messages to any others on the webinar by selecting someone's name from that list, and then you'll be able to start a private chat with them. And that will show up as a new tab on the bottom left of the chat box. The chat box is on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and you can just type what you'd like to share with everyone in that where it says chat everyone. So what you type there will be seen by all who are on, and you can just type what you want to share in that white bar and then either hit enter or click that little talking bubble icon to send your message. We'll have time for questions during today's webinar, but you're welcome to use that chat feature whenever you'd like. And during the Q&A periods, you can unmute your line by pressing *6 to verbally ask any questions or share any comments that you'd like to. The chat will also be using during the polling time, and you're welcome to use that just to say hello and introduce yourself to all others who are on today's webinar as well. Some common problems that I've seen are when folks are trying to connect using the Google Chrome browser or the new Windows browser. So if you're listening into the audio but have been having trouble connecting to the webinar room and are sure you're using the correct webinar link, I'd suggest first trying to open the link using a different web browser such as Firefox or Internet Explorer. And just a reminder, all of our lines are currently muted to keep the background noise down, but you can mute and unmute by pressing *6 on your telephone keypad. And as I said before, you can use the chat feature at any time. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be posting the recording to our Center for Tribes YouTube page and our Tribal Information Exchange. And we'll be sending links to the recording out to everyone after. If you missed our first webinar that we hosted with Jerry in December on Justice in Indian Country, you can find the recording of that webinar on our YouTube page right now. So that's live and ready for you if you wanted to take a look at that. I am here. If you have any technical questions, I'll be here throughout the webinar, so you can just shoot me a message and I'll do my best to help you. But I am now super excited to introduce today's presenter, Jerry Weisner. Jerry's an advisor to us here at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, and we're so fortunate to have her wisdom and expertise shared with us. She's also the executive director of the Native American Children's Alliance. So Jerry, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Okay, if you can still hear me.
I can hear you now. It looked like you were on mute. Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, thanks. I am, okay, just sent a chat, And I was just taking a moment to do that because I would like to encourage and invite everyone to take advantage of that. So if you're joining us, if you would could please remember to mute your line, and we will take care of this this webinar. We're going to be talking about domestic minor sex trafficking in Indian country. My name is Jerry Weisner, Chaho Chifkados Jerry Weisner, Muskogee, Obanagan, Keesit, and Comus. I am Muskogee Creek, and I'm currently sitting within the Creek Nation jurisdiction in the southern part of Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, shout out to everyone from Indian country, Oklahoma, recognizing that Oklahoma has a lot of Indians here, but there are a lot of natives across the country, and there's a lot of Indian country in the United States. So, welcome. We're going to be talking about domestic minor sex trafficking and all of its issues. I'm a tribal prosecutor. I'm also the executive director of the Native American Children's Alliance. We do a lot of training and working with tribes and organizations to improve the response of our multidisciplinary teams and child advocates for child abuse and sexual assault. So that's where domestic minor sex trafficking comes into play. I can talk about the things that I do and how much a prosecutor can do, but there's not any one person that can handle these cases. It takes a multifaceted response, and I like to work with multidisciplinary teams, and I will refer to them as MDTs. We'll also, just to make sure we're on the same page, I will refer to our domestic minor sex trafficking as DMST. So if I happen to make any reference to any other acronym you're not familiar with, just send me a chat real quick, and I'll make sure I try to introduce any acronyms that I use, but I do want you to be aware that that I'll be calling it excuse me, DMST as we move forward. I also want to let you know that some of the, I think someone has already asked for the information, the handout of the presentation will be made available. However, in the presentation itself, I used copyrighted materials and have given attribution so that if I'm ever federally prosecuted, it's going to be something sexier than copyright infringement. All right, so let's talk about DMST. We're going to start off by talking about what is Indian country and who is Indian, how domestic minor sex trafficking differs in Indian country. Then we're going to talk about how we can, within Indian country and across the country as well, how we can evaluate our laws and responses to improve those responses to DMST. We're going to talk about how we can reduce our vulnerability and our vulnerability within our communities, and talk about how we can use education and community involvement as a preventative measure. All of these kind of intertwine, these last three: evaluation of laws and responses, reducing vulnerability, education and community involvement. They all intertwine with each other, and I think that it is through those joint efforts or multifaceted efforts we can address some of these things, and so that's what we're going to talk about. So I appreciate you being with us. Here we go. And before we talk about how Indian country is different, we're going to talk about how we are similar and some of the many things that draw us together. The fact that we all come from families, whether you have a functional or dysfunctional family, a large family, or you're an only child, if you were adopted, or if you had a foster family, or if you took in your professional cohorts as your family, we all do come from a family. And we have people that we rely on and we can connect with. Okay, Maria, I hope you can hear us now.
I'll help.
Thank you. One of the things that we also have together that we share emotions. We may exhibit and express them differently from others, but the fact is we do experience emotions. We all have necessities and needs: food, water, sleeping, shelter, and we all need love. And I say this as a reminder. If many of you who work in, this is a point where I could ask, I'm curious if any of you are in law enforcement. I think we have a handful of law enforcement. We have a handful of Indian child welfare workers. We have possibly some advocates and maybe some lawyers. All of them back on. And just a quick survey, if you want to type in, what is your profession? Law enforcement, prosecutor, advocate, child protection. So why don't you let us know who we have out there? But I use this slide again to represent and to remind us the importance of love, love being an appropriate verb. This picture is from the Harlow, Dr. Harlow, who did experiments with monkeys in the 60s before ethics were adopted. This monkey was segregated from all other peers and from his mother, from everyone, and he fed and he coddled the little face-looking face that you see in the picture. And when he was then reintegrated with his peers and with other monkeys, it was too much stimulation. He didn't have any attachment, and there's a whole lot more to it, but I use it as a reminder of all of the children that we work with, that we are often picking up from drug-endangered homes, the deck home, or from in any situation where they've been neglected, deprived. The fact is that children not only need good, healthy families to take them in and shelter and clothing and all those necessities to be able to survive, but they need love, and love being an essential element for raising children with a healthy mental capacity to be productive adults and folks within our community. So I just wanted to throw that in. Here is a message to our tribal folks. So earlier I asked if anybody wanted to type in what kind of professions, what kind of disciplines do we have attending. So this is a question to follow up that. How many of you work with a tribe or are with a tribal agency, or if you're with another agency? I think we had some possibly from the ACLU. I'm not sure what state, but let me know where do you work and what are you doing? So I use this slide here as kind of a glamour shot from back in the day with the former Principal Chief Wilma Mankiller, who put the onus where I believe it should be. We must trust our own thinking, trust where we're going, and get the job done. When she is using this reference, the we is tribal people. We talk a lot about working with our kids, helping our kids, the trust, responsibility, and treaties of federal governments and state governments. But I also believe in her statement here that tribes are sovereign nations. And we are here today because our ancestors before us took care of things that would impact us. We are in the 7th generation, and it's our responsibility to take these measures for safety, for community health, to take these measures so that we will have a healthy and productive 7th generation from now. I share this one. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Spanish to know tonto. Tonto, I'm not a Spanish speaker, but I've been told that tonto is basically someone who's stupid or dumb. So there's tonto. And when we talk about we working in relationship or collaborative agreements, no, it's not like this. That's not the best type of relationship. So what I want to encourage is the we being, I'm a Law and Order SVU junkie. So their idea of we is a multidisciplinary approach. You've got a prosecutor, a mental health professional, medical health, and you have all the other professionals involved, all the investigators and detectives. And I'm always impressed that they can complete a case within 60 minutes. That's awesome. I can't, even on a good day. But I also know that they run into conflict. There's professional conflict. There's a conflict on how people look at the case and how they wish to proceed. But at the end, they work together. And so I want to share that with a lot of these cases, that conflict is almost inherent. Resolving the conflict is as important as addressing these matters in the first place. Because if we're caught off our toes, we're not going to be ready, nor will we be prepared for the next case that's going to be put on our desk, or that someone is going to call in and report. So I encourage you working with your teams and working with the multiple professionals and disciplines that you work with. Interpersonal issues will arise. Working through them is what makes us a strong team and what makes us professionals, so that we'll be able to be strong on our feet, so we can be there for the community and help there. We're talking about Indian country, and what makes Indian country unique? Well, there are a number of things, but let's look at this. Making sure that we recognize that there are no true pan-Indian issues. There are over 566, maybe 567 tribal nations in the United States. And just as a note, I use tribes and nations interchangeably. There is the Tulalip tribe. There is the Muskogee Creek Nation. Both of them are recognized the same. I think they're just interchangeable words, depending on how the tribe or nation wishes to have themselves addressed. But there is the Cherokee Nation in eastern Oklahoma that were from the Georgia, Carolina area that came to Oklahoma on what is known as the Trail of Tears. The 4 other tribes that make up the 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creeks, they had their own mass exodus from the southeast of the United States to Oklahoma. Many other tribes did as well. There are 39 federally recognized tribes here in Oklahoma, but that means there's so many others where they may be. So Indian country is throughout the United States. And the history is as vast and different as the tribes are. History accounts for who we are today. When I do a lot of introductions, it is important, depending on where I am and who am I talking to, it may be appropriate for me to introduce myself as my relation to my clan, my grandfather. Many tribal people are hesitant to work with outsiders because they're broken promises and obligations. You'll hear a lot of people talk about, and we're familiar with, the broken treaties, and that goes to a distrust for government. The distrust for government is not only the federal government. There's a lot of animosity that remains with states, with other non-tribal agencies. And so it's important to remember that there, not only are tribes different, there remains a lot of hostility. Tribes are different also because we have our tribal languages. And every tribal language is different, although some of them may sound similar. It's important to recognize the background and the impetus of that. Also recognizing that through the period of boarding schools, tribal languages were outlawed, and children were beaten if they spoke their tribal language while in a boarding school. Luckily, many of our tribes still have their language, and those languages played a significant role. For example, in World War II, where we had our code talkers. The picture here is of my dear friend who has walked on, Mr. Charles Chibody. He was Comanche, but there were the Choctaws, there were the Navajo code talkers. There were many other tribes that had code talkers, but I throw this in to remind us that there are a number of tribes and tribal people who still talk their language and teach it to their children now. Not only is our verbal communication even important, but even more important is our nonverbal communication, how we interact, how we carry ourselves, how our eyes shift from one to another. It's important in Indian country that we recognize those. Why does the reason or why is a child or an adult Native person reluctant to make eye contact? It's important to know that in many of those situations, and it's been carried on, that the lack of eye contact or avoiding eye contact is not shifty, and it's not because someone is following with falsities, but in fact a sign of respect. The same true with a handshake. I know that I've heard, and I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps, and you give a firm handshake. If you go on an interview, you better give a firm handshake as well, because first impressions matter. If you're in Indian country, be careful. You may buckle a handful of knuckles if you're shaking a very firm grip. A lot of Native people feel that, when you meet someone, you're not challenging them, but you're greeting them humbly and honestly. And so those are just a couple of the different ways that nonverbal communication is also unique and different when you get to Indian country. What else makes Indian country unique? The fact that we're going to talk about tribes and nations having their own constitution and their own forms of laws that are applicable within their jurisdiction. For the majority of this presentation, I will talk about non-PL 280 jurisdictions. Just as a quick note, PL 280, Public Law 280, was passed by Congress, which made several states, the tribes in several states, relinquish their criminal jurisdiction to the state. So in those situations, in those certain states, there's California, Alaska, there's a handful of others. But in those states, the tribes do not exercise criminal jurisdiction. Now, the remaining tribes in the remaining states, tribes function as a state within a state. We have borders, we have laws, we have law enforcement, and so the majority of this presentation will be to those jurisdictions. However, when we're going to talk about prevention, vulnerability, education, those are very applicable. So I just want to say, yes, we're going to talk about PL 280 and things that will affect any jurisdiction when we're talking about DMST, but with the caveat that when the next couple of slides here will be specific on Indian country tribes exercising their own self-determination, self-governing status. If you have any questions, you can type to me, and I'll be happy to answer those. What else makes Indian country unique? The fact that tribes were negotiating treaties before the United States. Tribes are active within the United Nations because they are recognized as nations. The U.S. government, the United States Constitution, does not govern the actions of tribes and tribal actions. So when someone comes to a tribe and says, oh, I have a First Amendment right for this or that, well, actually you don't. However, in 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act basically cut and paste the Constitution and the amendments to apply in Indian country, with the exception that if you cannot afford an attorney and you're in Indian country and you've been acting up, well, sucks to be you, because you are not afforded an attorney if you're indigent in Indian country. All right, so making sure that you recognize there are some differences. So the Constitution doesn't apply, but as a result of the Indian Civil Rights Act, most of those issues and amendments will. That's to say, I want to give kind of a caveat and update. As of right now, there is a pending decision within the Federal Appellate Court that may have a significant impact on Oklahoma tribes, and there could be a ripple effect. What I want to make note is this presentation, as of the 9th of January 2018, this presentation is addressing the current state of Indian law and Indian jurisdiction as we recognize it now. There could be I think that there are pending cert with the U.S. Supreme Court, so we'll see what happens with that case. But well, let's deal with the right here and right now. There's a lot of people trying to look into a crystal ball to say, well, what if? We'll wait for that till it happens. But as of right now, we're going to talk about the legal quagmire that exists and is what we know as Indian country and Indian country law. All right, what I'm sharing with you here is also what makes Indian country unique. There are 3 different types of Indian land where Indian jurisdiction can be exercised. Okay, we don't want to get it too far into the weeds because I want to make sure that this is just a quick overview for Indian country jurisdiction and why we're talking about DMST in Indian country. The fact that crime rates are higher in Indian country than any other place per capita in the United States. Murder against women, homicide against women in Indian country is higher per capita than anywhere else in the United States. And Congress made a note of this in 2009 and 2010 and passed the Tribal Law and Order Act. Now, if you know anything about Indian country, you know for any crime that a tribe is prosecuting, whether it be bad checks or homicide, the maximum sentence a native can receive is 1 year and or $5,000. With the passage of the Tribal Law and Order Act, recognizing the crime and violent crime especially was higher in Indian country, there were some exceptions and some details added so that tribes may prosecute some of the more heinous violent crimes with a maximum sentence of 3 years and or $5,000. So not much of a difference, but that's where it relies on our cross-deputization status, working with others, because there is also a federal component that you do not risk double jeopardy if a tribe is prosecuting a case at the same time as the federal government prosecuting. Okay, now why else are we talking about this? So it not only is that one definition I shared you, hold on a second, the one definition I shared with you of where Indian country is and what is Indian country, it also is further confused or can be confusing by who is Indian and who isn't. Now I'm going to share with this first of all and let you know that tribes have within their constitution, tribes determine who their membership and eligibility are. They also have their own blood quantum. Some tribes, I believe the Navajo Nation, recognize half-blood and more. The Muskogee Creek Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and I believe the other 5 tribes recognize any lineal descendant. That was an issue that came up with the baby Veronica case that was in the headlines a couple of years ago. Regardless if that baby was 1 million Cherokee or 4 full-blood Cherokee. The fact is that the baby was Cherokee, and that's how Cherokee recognized their membership. If you have any blood that is Cherokee, that is traceable to the Dawes Rolls of the Cherokee Nation, then you are Cherokee. But it's important, this is a little bit different. Now, tribes can make that determination, but when we're talking about criminal law and criminal law in Indian country, it is determined by who is Indian and who isn't. So I have this slide of handsome faces here that I share to help determine what would we do in this situation. So God help us if any of them traffic children or commit a crime in Indian country. But if they did, and let's say that they happened to commit this crime at the Muskogee Creek Nation Casino, our first gentleman up on the top left corner is Lou Diamond Phillips. Lou Diamond Phillips is from the Navajo Nation. So if he were guilty of a crime committed in Indian country, he would be Indian for the purpose of federal criminal Indian law. Our next gentleman, Benjamin Bratt, happens to be from a Peruvian tribe in South America. If he were committing the crime in Indian country, he would not be considered Indian for the purpose of federal Indian law. Remember, it needs to be a tribe in the United States. Now, with that being said, we have Adam Beach, who is well known for many of his movies. However, he happens to be from the Saulteaux tribe, who are from Canada. So if he is committing a crime in Indian country, he would not be considered Indian because he's not a member of a federally recognized tribe. And Canada has lots of First Nations people, but they're not federal. They're not within the 50 states that they're recognized. The next gentleman will show you how long and dedicated I am to stalking. This guy was one of the vampires in the movie Lost Boys with Kiefer Sutherland, maybe from the 80s. He happens to be from the Wyandot Nation, where I prosecute. And if anyone knows him, please encourage him to come back to the Wyandot Nation. But he is a tribal member. He would be considered Indian for the purpose of federal Indian law. In the middle, we have Johnny Depp, who went through a lengthy ceremony of being adopted into I believe it was the Comanche Nation. They had a large ceremony. They adopted him. They gave him a tribal membership card. However, now the tribe may recognize him, and that's fine. But if he were to commit a crime that would also fall under the federal regulations, he is not Indian because he does not have blood of a native. So that is hopefully it's not too confusing, but that further muddies the water sometimes when we're looking at federal criminal Indian law and Indian law in general. Who is Indian? Where did it take place? Along with what kind of crime did occur? I have this cheat sheet here that will be on your handout that I give to all of my officers in all of my jurisdictions, which is a quick who committed the crime, who is the victim, and where is the jurisdiction? Where did it fall? Where did it take place? And what is the type of crime? So hopefully that may be helpful to you or in any of your jurisdictions or your officers. Please feel free to share that. All right. We are now going to talk about addressing DMST, domestic minor sex trafficking in Indian country. Now, as we're starting off, and as our earlier agenda alluded, we're going to first talk about the evaluation of laws and responses in Indian country. What I'm sharing with you now are the federal statutes that are primarily used for any kind of prosecution of domestic minor sex trafficking in Indian country. So those are the statutes. And I want to pay specific, I don't like wordy slides, but I want to share this with you here. And I think it's important of all of them that we recognize this. Sex trafficking of children or by force, fraud, or coercion. All right, another little side note. As it says in the title, sex trafficking of children or by force, fraud, or coercion. If the child is 14 years or under, force, fraud, or coercion, it does not have to be an element, all right? They just have to be trafficked. Over the age of 15 and over, they will look, the federal prosecutors will look to force, fraud, or coercion. But it says, 18 U.S.C. 1591, whoever knowingly in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce or with the special maritime or territorial jurisdiction of the United States, that will be tribes. So when it says territorial jurisdiction, that covers tribes. Anyone who recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, advertises, maintains, patronizes, or solicits by any means a person or anyone whoever knowingly benefits financially or by receiving anything of value. I've got special highlight bolds on some of these words. Anything of value from participation in a venture which is engaged in an act described in violation of paragraph 1. You can find that. Knowing or exception where the constituting the violation of a paragraph 1 is advertising in reckless disregard of the fact that means of force, threats of force, fraud, coercion described in subsection or any combination of such means will be used to cause the person to engage in a commercial sex act or that the person has not attained the age of 18 and will be caused to engage in a commercial sex act shall be punished as provided. All right. All of that is very important, and there are a lot of words in there. But my question to you, that's the federal government. Those are their charging instruments. Those are what they're going to buy. So my question to you, what are the laws applicable to domestic minor sex trafficking in your tribal jurisdiction? All right, so let me rephrase this. If you're not in a tribal jurisdiction, or if you're in a PL 280 jurisdiction, or if you're just an agency that works, what are the laws applicable, or do you know the laws applicable to your tribe or to your jurisdiction that would apply for domestic minor sex trafficking? Does anybody know what their laws are? So there's the question. And here is something I want to point out. For tribes, if we do not have laws to cover domestic minor sex trafficking, then what are we doing? If we don't have a law that addresses DMST, then what are we going to enforce? If there's not a law on the book, then they can do it. I also want to point out, Oklahoma may have, maybe about 5 years ago, Oklahoma changed our laws, our state law, which used to address juvenile prostitution, because juvenile prostitution is so bad. And I remember I worked in D.C. for a while, and when I came back to Oklahoma, I was looking at the newspaper. There were all these. There was a big bust in Oklahoma City, and they had said that they had busted so many prostitutes and so many pimps, and maybe 8 juvenile prostitutes, and things were just so bad, and they were making it so much better. And it broke my heart, because not only in the state of Oklahoma, but in many jurisdictions, there is an age of consent. In Oklahoma, it's the age of 16. For many of the tribes, many of them that I prosecute, the age of consent is 18. So it's also important to know what is the age of consent in your jurisdiction. But how can you have a juvenile who cannot consent to sex, but would otherwise be arrested for juvenile prostitution? This is what we call an oxymoron, an emphasis on the word moron. This is where our laws are antiquated. So we need to look at our laws so that there is no such thing as a juvenile prostitute. Juveniles cannot consent to sex. Therefore, they can't sell anything that they don't possess. So what are they called? Juvenile prostitutes? Absolutely not. They are victims. And so terminology is very important as we address this forward as well. Our laws, our terminology, how we address them. I also want us to be, I think that it's very disheartening when we talk about in the arena of domestic minor sex trafficking, people are familiar with the word pimp, the word prostitute, but there is also what is referred to as the bottom bitch. And what does that mean? I don't know of any other that I call them the bottom. But when we're talking about the lingo and the terminology and what's going on, that's important for our laws and our lawmakers to make notice of these, and that we recognize what are the laws and who are our laws really going after, the victims and pimps, or should we be looking at the users, what they call the Johns? Should we be looking at that? All right. So I just want to toss that out there because I think that's an open-ended question for any and everyone, because I don't know of any of my tribes, with the exception of one, maybe in Oklahoma. I don't know of very many tribes who have a statute addressing domestic minor sex trafficking and make it illegal. So if you have a tribe that you do have sex trafficking and making it illegal, then I would love to know who you are and take a look at your laws. And kudos to you. For the rest of us, I think this is where a lot of it will apply, because we're addressing these things, and it's hard to train our law enforcement and our community and our multidisciplinary team professionals about domestic minor sex trafficking if it's not against the law. All right. What else are we going to talk about? I think it's important to talk about who is interacting with our victims. Now, I think it's important to train. How do we know what domestic minor sex trafficking is? And I'm going to share my own. I think this is where it helps, hopefully, in your experience and in mine. I have probably prosecuted 7 or 8 domestic minor sex trafficking cases. Only 2 of them were ever involving a pimp and involved Backpage, and I only had 2 cases that ever looked like that. And the victims had tattoos, and they looked like what we hear about a lot with the commercial sex trafficking industry, a lot of beat downs and violence and money and drugs. With that being said, the majority of the cases I have prosecuted that I have been involved with are what we refer to as either survival sex or for simple, that goes back to the definitions, the transmissions. I want to share one of the cases one of my earliest cases that we recognized was sex trafficking. But it didn't have the what we see in movies and what we see in a lot of the ads. In many of the cases that I have, or for this one, for example, I had a 4-year-old, and the mom and dad left the 4-year-old, only child. The mom and dad left the 4-year-old with a babysitter. Now, the babysitter was a registered sex offender, and they borrowed the babysitter's truck, and they went to town for a couple hours, and then they came back and they picked up their 4-year-old daughter. They got home with the 4-year-old daughter, and she was uncomfortable. She said that she was hurt. They called the police and find out that she had been sexually assaulted while in the care of the sex offender. Well, it came to my desk, and of course we're prosecuting the sex offender. However, I had issue, and I didn't feel comfortable with the fact that the parents left the 4-year-old with a known sex offender. Now, while my investigators were talking to the sex offender, he kept saying they knew. And so my investigator finally sat down with the perpetrator and said, okay, what are you talking about? Who are they? They knew what? So the perpetrator was telling us that the mom and dad traded the little girl for the truck so they could go town. They wanted to go to town. They wanted to go drinking, grab some groceries, and come back within a 2-hour span. So the perpetrator was telling us they knew what was going on. With the investigator being aware of sex trafficking, and we did a UA on the little girl and found out that the parents had given her some Benadryl. And upon further questioning, yes, they did know that leaving their 4-year-old with the registered sex offender, that something might happen. And then they borrowed the truck, or that in exchange for the little girl, they went to town. They used his truck. So we go back to that earlier definition, in exchange of goods and or services of any kind. So they got the truck in exchange for for a couple of hours with their 4-year-old girl. That was my very first domestic minor sex trafficking case. And I just want to point that out because I also know that many of us in Indian country, my grandpa used to tell me that, Indian people, we don't hurt other Indian people. Well, in this situation, I had parents who put up their 4-year-old daughter as trade and for services for a truck. So I want to, if it doesn't smell right, if there's something about it that's not right, pull back those layers of that onion until you can find out what is going on, until you can satisfy what is not right about this case. So I just wanted to share that with you, with who is our interaction with victims. And we've got 4-year-olds We can have 14, 44, 94-year-olds who can be victims at the hands of others. So when we look at who's interacting with our victims, we need to train our MDT, our multidisciplinary team, for this response so that law enforcement personnel will know what questions to ask, and they will know what they are looking for. And that goes back to the language of the statute. What are they going to enforce? And being aware that we don't have 12-year-old juvenile prostitutes. We have victims, and making sure that they get victim services, that we have our victims advocates who are aware of the dynamics of domestic minor sex trafficking. How about our court personnel? Prosecutors, this is the onus I put onto you and myself. We have to sell this. It is very important that under these situations that we recognize what is the case. We've got to sell this to a judge or to a jury. It's our responsibility to make sure that we fully meet the elements of the statute, but we detail what's going on, and that court personnel is familiar with domestic minor sex trafficking. That includes tribal administration. It's very important that they recognize what domestic minor sex trafficking is so they can support your efforts. Also, what's very important, if you have older victims, teenagers, all the way up, in many situations, if they are considered property, or they may be in a relationship with the perpetrator or the abuser or the pimp, emergency protective orders or any kind of protective orders or family law issues. There may be children who are at issue or custody, or the children are being used as collateral or any other circumstance. We need to make sure that we have those services to be able to help victims, because more likely than not, they are being threatened, or family members are being threatened, their harm, safety, or livelihood. So making sure that we have all of those resources and professionals available, and they know what's going to, how they can deploy those services for victims, as well as all of them need to make sure that they are culturally appropriate responses for the jurisdiction that they are in. Okay. So if we're looking at on the scene, who do we need to make aware of all of this? You see a handful of people here: prosecutors, medical personnel. There are many times where EMS is called out because somebody calls 911, somebody's gotten a beat down, they've been injured. They need to know how to respond and to appropriately address others who are in this situation. Many of us work in situations where we are mandated reporters. So how do we recognize when there is domestic minor sex trafficking and then we're under a mandate to report? Anything that involves a child with sex, I would say as a safe precaution, anyone under the age of 18 or possibly 16, depending on your jurisdiction, it would be a mandated report. But you also have to be careful if you have a duty of confidentiality, how you would go about doing that. And that gets to more of a designated professional issue. But this goes to your MDT, to your tribe. It is important to train these first responders about how to report, how to recognize domestic minor sex trafficking, and what to do with them under the law. It's also important that we bring about community awareness. How can we make sure that the community is aware of all of this, because they're basically the eyes and ears. We'll talk a little bit more in this presentation a little bit later about the community awareness and how that might be how that might be applicable and useful in your community. In an MDT response, we need to make sure that we recognize the fact that not all of our victims look the same. So, for example, you have, if you're not familiar, we have compliant and non-compliant victims. So in the example I shared with you, I had a 4-year-old that was a victim of DMST. She was compliant. She was sad because she was taken from her mother, but she was compliant. Now, I've had other situations where I have had 15-year-olds who are what I would consider non-compliant victims. 15 years old, they're using sex as survival, couch surfing, if anyone's familiar with that term. Basically what they want to do is, hey, you let me sleep on your couch. I need a place to stay. My mom and dad, my mom's new boyfriend, I don't like him. Whatever the situation may be, they may be run away from home or from foster home, or things may be bad there. Look, I just have to have sex with you and I can sleep on your couch and have some food. Done. All right. If we're still talking about a 15-year-old, a 15-year-old still cannot consent. So we don't have a compliant victim. Although she may have had consent, 15-year-olds cannot consent. But when we start asking her or him, when we start asking the victim, so what is your relationship? And many times they have a pre-existing relationship with the perpetrator. And it may be a loving relationship, and they don't want to turn on them. Or if they are in one of the commercialized sex trafficking situations, they know that they're going to be hurt or other threats of harm or violence on them or their loved ones have been made. So they're non-compliant. And they're going to tell you that you need to go jump, in a nice or unfriendly way. They're going to tell you to go jump off a cliff and leave them alone because they are not a victim. A lot of them don't want to be referred to as victims. So in that situation, we have a non-compliant victim who we know that they have been victims of sex trafficking. For those considerations, I really want you to take into consideration who is going to be your forensic interviewer. For tribes, I recommend working with your CAC or with someone ahead of time to lay the game plan on who's going to interview these victims. If you have a non-compliant victim, I have worked with the federal, they call them federal CAFIs, the Federal Child Abuse Forensic Interviewers, who have a lot of experience working with non-compliant victims, and especially with victims of sex trafficking. I would recommend that you contact them if your CAC doesn't already have someone who can investigate and interview victims of sex trafficking, because I think that those are important, not only the compliant, but especially the non-compliant, because they're survivors, and they know that their survival may or may not have anything to do with relaying to you what has happened to them and their victimology. We also need to make sure that we have immediate services available. That could include the day after pill, any kind of other medical or mental health services. Many of the victims feel guilty. They don't want anyone to know. The shame and embarrassment they think that they're going to bring upon their family is so overwhelming that they consider suicide. So we need to keep all of these into consideration when we have a victim of trafficking, as well as safety concerns. The safety concerns will be if you have someone where there is commercial trafficking and a pimp considers one of his victims and prostitutes, he considers them property. So if you have someone who tells or discloses that they have been victimized, then you're likely to have somebody who wants to come around and collect that property. So again, protective orders and making sure where, I think we're about to get to it, where are we going to house these kids and where are these things going to take place? This goes back to the MDT, the multidisciplinary case management. And I say case management, but really what it means is the preparatory work, making sure that all of the resources are available to ensure the safety of the victim, to include their placement. In my jurisdictions where I prosecute, and Indian Child Welfare, we work hand in hand. Do we have any homes? This is a question that I always ask, do we have any homes? So we're doing recruiting efforts because we don't have enough homes. So if any of you listening have a plethora, have an excess of certified, tribal homes that they want to take some kids, and please let me know because I have a whole lot of kids that I need to place them. But the reality is that we don't, and in most situations, we're short on them. However, when we're thinking about a child who has been trafficked, I would recommend this. I treat the placements for my victims as a medical or a specialized placement. I have made the mistake of putting a trafficked child in a children's home to find out later that they have been recruiting other children for, they try to make it glamorous, and I realized later she was a bottom that I placed in the home. So she's talking about the glamorous life and how they can get out and go to parties and do all this stuff. So then many of the other kids at the home were wanting to go with her. I've also made the mistake of placing a trafficked kid in a home that was newly certified as foster care. 2 days after placement, I get a foster mom calling me saying, you better come get her now because she's walking around the house in a thong, and she's talking about taking birth control, and she cusses worse than we ever thought of. And so come get her, and we're happy to be placements, but please bring me an infant. So where you place victims of DMST is very important for their safety as well as for the families or for the environment that you put these victims into. The support and advocacy during the interaction is important, as well as the emergency ongoing services, culturally competent services, any of these other things, making sure this is all pre-worked. This is work that you do beforehand, so that when you have a situation, you're not kind of working behind the ball and under the pressure of a clock. All right, we have I'm catching up now. The question I'm hoping everybody can help us out with: does your tribe, agency, tribe, or etc. have a designated response for domestic minor sex trafficking situations? Okay, so we talked about the laws and how multidisciplinary teams can respond, and how a lot of it is going to be on the front end work in preparing for these situations. But now we're going to talk about how do we reduce the vulnerability to domestic minor sex trafficking in Indian country. Now that's also looking at all of these different statutes, all these different studies in the history. The fact is, we're talking about when we're talking about Indian country, we're talking about the most vulnerable within the country. So how do we reduce that in an already vulnerable community? Well, let's look at who are DMST victims. In order to help make sure we protect the vulnerable, let's look at them. Many of them are men, victims are women. Two-spirited and transgender are especially vulnerable. They feel that they are not understood or accepted by their family, and they tend to be runaways. Runaways are prime. They're just like low-hanging fruit to perpetrators and to pimps. So what are our services that we can be able to provide them, and making sure that we have appropriate services as they come along? Adults, children, various educational backgrounds, people with degrees, people who have GEDs or none of the above. A lot of our people who are victimized are learning disabled or have other issues with mental health. So U.S. citizens, foreign nationals, or any of these, anyone can be a victim or could be victimized, but we're already looking again at the vulnerability of the vulnerable, in a sense. So who are the perpetrators? Well, of course, they prey on the vulnerable. They recruit often through promises of a better life, and it's often a lie, if not always a lie. And the perpetrators and the pimps are opportunistic. They often start off as loving relationships, Or in the example that I told you about the 4-year-old, it was a family member. It was the biological mom and dad who put the child up. And many of them can be in a survival sex situation such as that. So looking to our vulnerability and who are the perpetrators, who are the victims, and what is going on there. Politicians, diplomats, and others. Sorry. So I share this to be on the lookout. Any of these issues can help keep an eye out for who may be trafficked and who will know. This addresses the elements of vulnerability, but remembering vulnerability is multifaceted because we have historical trauma, we have intergenerational trauma, we have jurisdictional issues and responses to complicate things, the lack of resources, the lack of knowledge, and above all, a lot of apathy. So when we are on the lookout, if we can get beyond those things, a lot of perpetrators will treat their victims as property. And in order to have property, they get branded or otherwise with what's called tattoos. In many situations where there's domestic violence, it could be there, public businesses, events, pregnancies, social media. I want to make a special note of truck stops. And if just as a kind of a quick survey, if anyone has ever heard the term lot lizard, this goes back to our terminology. In Oklahoma, we have a lot of interstate freeways. We have I-40, which runs from the East Coast to the West Coast. We also have I-35, which runs from Canada to Mexico. They intersect in Oklahoma City, just outside of Oklahoma City. So you could go from coast to coast, north to south, and be taken from any of these areas, and lot lizards, where I hate to use the term, but making sure that we're familiar with the terminology. There are often children who work truck stops and service truckers. We've also recognized in many situations that some of the truckers will have particular stickers on their door showing their proclivity. There's sexual proclivity and the perverseness. However, I do want to also mention that there have been, as a result of lot lizards and truck stop issues with sex trafficking, there have been a lot of ministry and professional organizations that have been set aside and set up specifically for trafficking. So there is another situation where I would encourage you to utilize and find out what are the resources within your area to join forces and take advantage of those that are already or designated specifically for the rescue and awareness of domestic minor sex trafficking. The vulnerability. Do you have a trained domestic minor sex trafficking advocate? Do they know that VD, venereal diseases, or venereal infections are an issue that need to be looked at right away? Where, as I mentioned earlier, where are we housing our victims? And is there a local number? This will come back into, as we're going to talk here shortly, about the community involvement. If someone is being trafficked, who do they call? They could call a 1-800 line that goes into a national database, or is there someone in your community? This is where I think we can shore up some of this vulnerability by making our own numbers, our own resources. Who do they call? 911. Does 911 know who your domestic minor sex trafficking advocate or referral is? And what would they do if someone called and said, hey, I'm being trafficked, I'm in a bad situation, what do we do? A lot of them will go to the police department, but therein, I think there's where law enforcement and advocacy will go hand in hand in responding to these. Runaways and teen services. I got a call just recently from another state where a lady said that her teen have they're running away. They've been reported to police, but police have chased them down so many times that they're not going after the kids anymore. They're near a big city, and she's worried about them being trafficked. I was like, well, of course, because runaways are runaways or otherwise considered throwaway children, abused children, when they're simply trying to survive, are perfect prey for DMST. So in that situation, what services, what teen recovery or runaway services do we have in your location that would be able to address these? This goes through our vulnerability. If we have teenagers running around all hours of the night with either no construction or they have no place to live, then that makes them vulnerable for survival sex, to pimps, to anything else. So I throw that out there as a vulnerability consideration. What are we going to do with kids that are just trying to survive? So what do we offer? I think it's important to look at that and find out in your community, what do you have? Services for female victims, true, but also the mental and medical health services for male victims, in recognizing that our two-spirits, transgender, and other children and victims need unique services, or they may need unique services. We need to make sure that we're prepared for them and that we have wraparound services. So it's not just the mental health or finding a place, safe place to live. A lot of our victims have not been attending school. They've had their education on the street, and they know how to survive. So we have to re-educate and reprogram these victims and recognize that it's going to take a little while. It's an education program, but by supporting and providing services and resources and networking to also have these things, we'll be able to help more children. Now, let's talk about addressing domestic violence, addressing domestic minor sex trafficking in Indian country. So how are we going to educate Indian country? How are we going to involve Indian country? Sex trafficking seems to be the buzzword these days. Everybody wants to learn about it. But the harder part is, what do we do when we actually have one? They're difficult cases. They really don't want you. They don't want you to intervene. They want to be left alone. They're already on survival mode. So how do we educate and involve the community in these situations where we're very vulnerable? I want to share a little bit with you about one of my experiences that didn't go so well but turned into a learning experience. I worked for a tribe, and we were updating some laws, and I wanted to pass a baby car seat law because I had been driving around on tribal roads, and I see kids just jumping around like popcorn in the back seats of cars, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is a no-brainer. So at the next general council meeting, I put on the agenda that we wanted to adopt a law for baby car seats, and it came up, and I told them why I felt that this was important, and I wanted to vote for it, and nobody voted for my baby car seat law. And after the meeting, I knew some of the elders and some of the ladies, and I pulled them aside. I was like, baby car seats, don't we want the kids to be healthy and, not hurt? And one of the elders told me, but you didn't ask us. So that was a hard lesson that I learned. And 1 month later, I put together a community meeting. And I got the casino to make some hot dogs, and we had balloons for kids. And what I realized is that I pushed my own agenda rather than talking to the community. And so we had hot dogs, we had balloons for kids, and I had some other professionals come in and help me talk about car seats and why it was important. But the more important part was I asked the community, what do you feel is important? How do you feel we should improve the laws? What are things that you want to see passed? And at the end of the meeting, we came up with 5 new laws. And one of them was the car seat. But in the order of priority, they pointed out a number of other things that I really hadn't given thought to. So the involvement of community is paramount. Inviting the community, making them a part of this, because law enforcement can't handle this all day long. They're not the answer to this, and we can't arrest our way out of it. Neither is the same for advocacy, for medical health, mental health, prosecutors. Poof, no. It's going to be our eyes and ears, and it is the community themselves, the grandparents who are raising kids, the parents who have a teen who is always, an at-risk teen and wants to run away, or those are the parents, the eyes and ears, and the community members that we need. But they don't know about DMST until we talk about the vulnerability, talk about how we can help, and talk about the fact that arresting our way out of this is not the answer, but we need to put up a community force to be able to help ourselves. We also need to inform the community by starting with the administration, getting their support. They need to know so that they can provide or assign resources wherever possible. That is also going to involve outreach, any of the issues there, community meetings. Again, as I mentioned before, with any of the community meetings, I always have food, even if I have to pony up for it myself. Otherwise, you're likely not to get any people. I also take advantage of the Elderly Nutrition Center to, I have captive ears if I go talk about that there, and I'll do a presentation. They need to know they're a vulnerable community, and they need to know who to call. So those are just a couple of strategies, and I'm just kind of curious if any of you have any kind of outreach or community meetings or anything else that you used in your area that contributed to the awareness or education of DMST. I also want to include the involvement of the youth. I mean, if we're talking about a vulnerable community, we can talk to the elders, and it's important that it be a blanket outreach program. But let's also look to the vulnerable. Kids should be talking about it. Kids can help each other who know about these situations. So making sure that you have a youth council, youth involvement, that is paramount to being able to make a successful program that can be able to reach your vulnerable people. I also want to point out the PSAs and campaigns. I shared with you the redsandproject.org. And with me here, I received their information from a presentation I saw of theirs last year. And so I wrote to them at the redsandproject.org and said, hey, I would like some sand. So they sent me a little package of red sand. And what we're going to do is take a picture of us putting the sand in a crack on a sidewalk or somewhere. What it's to do is to represent those people in sex trafficking who have fallen through the cracks. It's just a PSA movement. So, if you want to email them and say, hey, I would like to do this. I think that that's a good beginning start of community involvement and have the kids put something out there. But there are a number of national programs that are doing these campaigns and announcements. I also want to give a special shout out to the St. Regis Mohawk. They received a special grant, and they used their own youth who are very, very good actors, and they made several commercials on what is teen dating violence, what is domestic minor sex trafficking. All of that with at the end is call this number. They had a specially designated number so that was easy to remember. So the whole community knew about it. They also used stills from the video commercials to put up billboards. And, you could drive down the highway and see that. So there are a number of different things that could go on. So if I just tossed that out there because I'm curious, and I think that this is important to know within other jurisdictions. What are you doing? And what have you found that's helpful, and what have you found that's not helpful? I want to bring attention to our next survey, which is going to ask, does your tribe and or community have education or outreach programs for domestic minor sex trafficking concerns? So I hope that you'll take a second to take a look at that, and it looks like many of you do not. So if any of you do have programs, please let me know. I've shared the Red Sands Project with you. St. Regis Mohawk had a great video and billboard program simply by letting people know. Flyers, I've seen some tribes just print out, 500 pages, and they went to the schools to make presentations on who to call and what is sex trafficking and how to be aware of it. So there are a number of ways that you can do it, but I think that it's paramount to involve the community, to involve the tribal administration, and have them support your outreach and your efforts. Seek community input. As I mentioned earlier with the baby car seat law that I tried to get done, I think it's important for tribes to recognize they have to keep updated with their laws for technology. Most of the advertising that's going to take place for domestic minor sex trafficking is online. They used to have, Backpage was a big one until they shut it down. And I was a little bit saddened and disappointed by that because that was a known interface. And if you shut it down, well, it just goes underground or goes somewhere else. But technology, the manufacture, the possession, the distribution of child pornography, make sure that your jurisdiction has laws that address those issues, because that is one of the major ways that DMST is being promoted and advertised. Again, youth involvement and councils, having their awareness, having them come up with ideas about what is the best way to bring about safety issues and concerns. They probably have some really awesome ideas that can involve technology. If there's any programs, I don't know if there are any apps that could be out there, but having your youth involvement is paramount, as well as a point person or representative. You can use an actual person. Call, Sally Lee, because she addresses, or she's the officer, or she's the advocate that addresses it. In many places, they use McGruff the crime dog because you have personnel changeovers, and if you have Sally Lee's picture all over everything, you get somebody else in to do that, then, your stuff is kind of dated. So make something or come up with some logo or some idea that the community can see and readily recognize as the domestic violence issues. Let's see. All right, we're getting close to the end of time. If anybody has any questions, anything that I need to, that you want to bring up, please, we've got time in the chat, so luckily I was able to time this a little bit better so we'd have time for review or for any kind of questions. What I want to do here is just remind everybody, in review, we need to educate our community. We need to educate our professionals. We need to recognize the signs of domestic minor sex trafficking in all its various forms. How do we tell people to report? Do they report it straight to the police or within law enforcement? Is there a designated officer? And has our law enforcement been trained so that when they have a situation, DMST situation, do they call an advocate to go on scene with them? Do they know to take a victim straight to the hospital or to trigger a SANE or SART, the Sexual Assault Response Team? Are they a part of this? I encourage you to raise awareness. only through awareness, only through the community and making sure everyone is aware of what this is, we can truly address it, and that we take action, that we have our laws within our tribes and within the states that are appropriate to take action, and that we're not prosecuting our victims, that we're taking care of our victims by providing them with appropriate services. I want to take a special note right here to share with you. I did a presentation in November in another state, and it was a co-presentation with a federal prosecutor. And she was telling about a case that she was prosecuting where there was a 15-year-old who ran away, a tribal girl. She ran away from home and ran away from the tribe, and she went to the city, and she was staying with various people. She found a pimp. He started trafficking her. She wanted to go home, but he made threats of violence to her. Somehow she came, and they found her with a handful of other victims, and they were prosecuting the case. She just happened to be a 15-year-old Native tribal girl who was caught up as a victim in this bad ring. They needed her testimony. The federal prosecutors needed her testimony for this prosecution because she was the one that had the most information on this pimp as to where he was going, his other methodology. But she wanted to go home, and her reservation was about an hour to 2 hours away. She wanted to go home. She wanted to be with her mom. The federal prosecutor took the girl into custody under a material warrant arrest and held her for approximately 15 days until she testified, and then released her. I can tell you that the tone and the mood toward the federal prosecutor became hostile when she talked about doing this. And I don't blame the crowd. I was mad at her. But I say all of this to share with you, yes, and I work a lot with the feds, with federal prosecutors, with FBI, and with BIA. That was a very heavy-handed way in handling a domestic minor sex trafficking victim. Is to take the victim into custody and put the victim under arrest. However, I think that's where it's important for us to look at our services. Could the tribe have intervened? Just like your Indian Child Welfare Service, where there's notification given if a child is taken into custody. Well, if a child is taken into custody under any other statute or they're a delinquent, delinquency does not trigger the Indian Child Welfare Act. So we need to be reaching out or try to work as much as we can on those that could otherwise be classified as a delinquent when they are in fact victims. Then the following question is, do we provide services to our victims if they are outside of the reservation? Are there health or other resources that can be provided to victims? How about any kind of financial assistance to get home or to find a place to live temporarily? Or what are those services? Remembering that not every tribe has a certain amount of tribal members, but a lot of tribal members do not live on the reservation or at the headquarters, and they live somewhere out. So do you have the wherewithal, or do you have services that if Milwaukee called Oklahoma and said, hey, we're in Minneapolis and we've got some Creek girls here that are being trafficked? That's a question for the Creek Nation. Can we provide services to our tribal members where they are? So that's another question, another issue I want to raise because, our tribal members are all over the place. Are we able to provide them resources wherever they may be? Okay. Here are a couple of other resources I wanted to share with you, and also point out the importance of a protocol. If a child goes missing, whether a runaway or abduction or any other, if a child is missing, what is your protocol? Recognizing that every minute counts, if not every second counts. Is there a protocol within your jurisdiction on how to respond to missing children? How then do you respond to runaway children? Because those are our most vulnerable category of victims. Those are the ones that we need to make sure if they go missing, if they are abducted, or if there's an alleged abduction, how are we going to respond to that as the tribe? Do you call NCMEC? Do you call, who do you call? Is there a protocol set up so that you would be able to follow up with that? There's also, I've shared with you the Human Trafficking Task Force, as well as the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project is well known. They've been working with numbers of protocols and programs and community information for a long time. So that will be, those are a couple of resources here that we can share with you, as well as if you pull up tribal domestic minor sex trafficking, you'll come up with a number of resources. So, and I also want to, again, mention the Red Sand project. I really have found that was good for my tribe, and so we are utilizing that. I'm also sharing any kid that comes within my jurisdiction or is on my docket, whether they were abused, neglected, or if they have been victimized or delinquent. They're my kids, and I don't want to say that they're Jerry's kids, but they are Jerry's kids. And I also have several nieces and nephews, and wherever they may be, they know that Auntie Jerry is the protector hen of all. And I share this picture on the left. I made it into an iron-on. I had a little nephew that said that at nap time, the teacher kept pushing his head down on the mat to try to for him to take a nap, and he didn't want to take a nap. He said, she pushed my head down and it hooked. I said, okay, I'll be back. So I went and got him a T-shirt and put this on it and put my information and contact information. I put a business card in his back pocket and said, look, make sure your T-shirt sees your T-shirt. And I say that to all of you also, wherever you may be, for all the kids that you're taking care of, whether they be your own or your family, or all the kids that you are professionally responsible for, whether they be on your docket or on your mind. I want to thank you for everything you're doing to protect our kids, to protect our community. I want to thank everything, and I'm grateful for everything that helped us get to this 7th generation where we currently are. And I ask for your help and your assistance to help us make it a safe and beautiful world for our next 7th generation that should come up to us. I'll finish with, there's there's my email. I'll leave that one on there. If there's any way that I can be of assistance to you, if you need another member on your MDT, if you have questions about something that's going on in Indian country, domestic minor sex trafficking, or child abuse, please use me as a resource. If I don't have the answer, then I know lots of people. I know lots of smart people. I know lots of people who give a damn about kids and want to help. So please let me be a resource to you and help you in any situation where I may. And with that, we will conclude the presentation. I will turn it back over to Laura. Thank you. Mado Hadam Shi Chafli.
Thank you so much, Jerry. You're incredible. We have about 3 minutes left. If anyone had any questions or comments that they wanted to share, you can type them into the chat box, or please feel free, if you're connected to the audio using your telephone, to press *6 on your telephone keypad, and you can unmute your line and share whatever you'd like. I also want to point folks to the download the presentation. That's a new box on the bottom right hand of your screen. If you click on the file name, the DMST webinar handout, you'll be able to download the file. And you can save that right to your desktop from the webinar screen here. I also wanted to share on behalf of our partners at the Butler Institute, Erin Poole, she's my colleague who's on this webinar here with us today as well, but you'll be getting an email from her with a very short survey about the webinar, and she's going to be sending that out today. So if you can, just take a few minutes to share your feedback with us on that survey. Not hearing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. I'll leave this screen open so you can download the presentation,